Hi, everyone. Just want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about advancing medical imaging through assistive AI. So introducing myself, I'm Israni. I'm the global marketing leader for providers and health plans at Google Cloud. And so that you know the lens that I'm looking at the world, prior to Google, I've held commercial leadership roles at Salesforce, Intel, Evidation, and Medtronic. I'm a computer scientist originally, and for nearly 20 years, I've been passionate about where computer science and healthcare interact. So much so that I dedicate time outside of work to this space as well, advising and mentoring healthcare startups and supporting a nonprofit, Hospital for Hope. I'm super excited to introduce our featured guest today, Dr. Daniel Hanley, who is a director of Brain Injury Outcomes Division and the professor for Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and principal investigator for Johns Hopkins-Tufts Trial Innovation Center. He's a leading expert on multiple types of brain injury and a professor of neurology, neurosurgery, and anesthesiology, critical care medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine since 1996. Some of you may know that Dr. Hanley's 35 years of medicine have centered on areas of clinical trial design, organization, and interpretation of drug and device trials, development of strategic research plans, and FDA regulatory compliance. And he has more than 70 clinical and basic research grants, predominantly from the NIH and the FDA. He's published nearly 300 articles in peer-reviewed journals, has received the Alexander Humboldt Research Prize for his accomplishments in brain injury research, and has extensive clinical trials experience in the fields of stroke, hemorrhage, trauma, and brain infections. Next, I want to introduce Bruno Nardone, who's the global leader of healthcare and life sciences at Quantiphi. His career in healthcare spans more than 25 years in roles including executive leadership at global health IT service and solution companies, as a business strategy consultant and a hospital administrator. Mr. Nardone is a fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives and serves on the board of the New England HIMSS. He earned his Master's of Health Systems Services Administration from the George Washington University and a Bachelor of Science from Cornell University. And lastly, I want to introduce Kjell Carlson, who's a principal analyst at Forrester with expertise in data science, AI, and advanced analytics. His research helps organizations take advantage of the increasing untapped potential of these analytics technologies to drive growth and transform existing ways of doing business. Kjell has more than 15 years of experience in driving strategic insights from data across roles in strategy, research, management consulting, big data, healthcare, and cloud-based solutions. Given that there's been a consumerization of healthcare, I think all of us have been not only seeing this in our professional lives, but we're also living it on the healthcare front. And this has spurred on a big shift with technology, cloud adoption to back some of these new consumer healthcare models. So Bruno, I'd love to get your take on cloud and AI's role here. More specifically, how are you seeing AI and cloud empowering patients to more actively engage in their own health outcomes?
You know, to start with, I think the value of democratization of data is in achieving personalization of care. All right, so you touched on those two things in your question, and I think they're really critical. You know, for many years, we've been forced in healthcare to sort of try to fit square pegs into round holes because it's hard to get at a level of personalization, of understanding what's going on with the individual, based on factors outside of what we can see in the confines of a clinical setting, whether it's a 5-minute or 10-minute office visit or even a hospitalization. Getting the optics into what's going on outside of that is really what's required to kind of get to personalization. We're also simultaneously seeing, you know, kind of proof point after proof point that says to get patients activated, engaged in their care, and really feel like they could impact their outcomes personally, it requires that level of personalization. Now, kind of expand that yet further into thinking about, well, how do I do that? It really requires kind of getting our arms around a much larger universe of data than we typically manage within healthcare. And that's hard to say because even within the project that we're talking about today, you know, the case of the CAT scans in the study that we did with Johns Hopkins involved petabytes of data. However, when we start to really think about personalization, we now think about, you know, kind of on the deep science side, looking out toward data sets coming from genomics and proteomics and metabolomics and all of these advanced diagnostic tools that are emerging, more even more detailed versions of images, whether kind of radiological or other, that give us views into the body. But then on the other end of the spectrum, where we start to get into really understanding psychosocial parameters, socioeconomic parameters on the patient, that really kind of rounds out the picture of what's going on with this individual, so that we don't just try to kind of push them one way based on a diagnosis, but rather really on understanding what's happening with them personally. A short example might be, kind of thinking about the diabetic. And I know we use the kind of individuals managing diabetes for a lot of examples in healthcare, because partly people understand that it's a good example that way, but also it's a very large segment of the population. The incidence of diabetes in the United States is roughly 10% of the population. When you think about all of these people kind of trying to manage their lives, live their lives, while managing diabetes, we can immediately sort of extrapolate that there is no one diabetic, and there's no kind of one way to recommend helping individuals be successful managing this chronic condition. It requires really understanding what's happening with that individual outside of the diagnosis and even their daily blood sugar levels, to really understand, do they live in a food desert? Are there kind of financial challenges that they're dealing with? Do they have a support network around them to help them get through this? Are there cognitive challenges that we need to be wary of as we design care plans to help them? Getting back to your original question, you could see how the democratization of data, really being able to access all that, kind of use it to drive insights that then support care teams, physicians, the patient, and the patient support network in an orchestrated and coordinated way, is really what we're driving toward around all of these solutions. So it's an exciting time, but kind of it then again points to the challenges that we're facing in getting this all to work neatly together.
I guess if you don't mind me jumping in on that one, I would say there's one thing that gets hidden in there is also just the democratization of the analytics techniques for leveraging that data. So part of it is accessing that data and being able to use it. Part of it's being able to access the tools that you need to do this and the infrastructure that you need in order to be able to use those tools. And part of it is on having the skills that you need in order to use those tools. And the really exciting thing here, I think, is the degree to which democratization is happening across all of those different pathways simultaneously. When it comes to enabling folks to have access to that data, to have access to the tools, to have access to the infrastructure they need to process that data, but also the advances that are happening in terms of making those tools so much easier to use, such that you can now involve your subject matter experts in the process. Whereas previously, yes, your data scientists could use them if they were supported by your ops professionals who would be able to give them access to those, if they were supported by your IT teams who were going in and having the on-prem infrastructure in order to go in and process that, as well as all of the data behind that. Whereas now you're seeing solutions that are enabling folks to go in and, within, like in the context of COVID, go in and share access to the data, the compute, the tools across internal and external parties in a secure fashion. And again, do this with tools that it's not just the data scientist using, but it's the data scientist as well as other types of researchers, as well as folks who are very close to who are domain experts. So that now you can bridge that gap in a way that was very difficult to do previously.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kjell. And you touched on all of the reasons why the cloud is so critical here in terms of really improving access to the horsepower you just described. Even large academic medical centers, and I kind of invite Dan to share his experience pre-project. Accessing the type of compute power, the type of enablement tools and facilitated tools for interoperability and management of data and just across a broad spectrum of stakeholders in a community of care is really what the cloud is sort of changing the game around. And it is an exciting time because it's unlocking that access for mainstream healthcare in a way that is allowing us to really have a tremendous impact on patients' lives.
I'd have one comment, Polly. Kjell and Bruno, I think, went down the very important path of precision medicine, and the customer who receives care one at a time, and that's the major focus of our investment in healthcare. But as a disruptive physician scientist, the real advantage of the speed and low cost of this processing is across populations, and we can get into that in a bit. But we can think about problems across people now that we were never able to do before. And that's part of my clinical trial business.
And I'm really glad you brought that up, Dan. One of the things I was thinking of as we were all talking about this is the role of data interoperability through all this. So being able to unlock that, de-identifying all that data and taking that data from so many different data types. I think someone mentioned proteomics, genomics. We're unlocking all these new data sets, behavioral data. And if we take that all together, clinical data, look at it, then you get a really clear view of the patient. And then you can apply, like Dan is talking about, a lot of the models to understand the population at large, and then apply that, then on an individual context, and apply it in a care setting.
We're all, you know, I don't know, there are 7 billion of us, I guess, and we are all in the same species. And I'm highly in favor of personalization, but where the rules are the same for everybody, it really helps to look at the bigger numbers.
Yes, I think there's an important point there where it's so yes, this enables personalization of medicine, but it's one of those things where there's an incredible amount of low-hanging fruit, and I don't think it's not like we haven't tapped through all of those things, which are, again, as I think Dr. Hanley is what you're saying, is that are common through us, but we really weren't able to get at previously because the kinds of data that we needed for it were this sort of unstructured data, either whether in terms of medical imaging data or whether it is in terms of NLP data or whether it's in terms of genome sequence data. What these deep learning techniques have enabled us to do is go in and mine those highly unstructured data sources for these kind of signals that were hidden. And sometimes those signals are highly personalized, and sometimes those signals are applicable to everybody. They were just we couldn't find them before. So there's an element that about the types of data that we're able to use. But then I think as both Bruno and Dr. Hanley have spoken to, is it's about also leveraging deep learning to look across those multiple different data types at the same time, which again, prior to deep learning techniques was extremely time intensive. It's very compute intensive now. It's very data intensive now, but we can brute force a lot of that with computational horsepower, which enables us to make headway against it in a way that we just couldn't with humans before.
Or you could only do it in a small number of humans, and the validity of the inference is really only important when you go to the population.
Absolutely. I'm seeing interesting things about folks also using machine learning as a way of generalizing from particular subsets of the population. So you'll have instances where people are able to look at things like tuberculosis from radiology scans that are from one part of the world, and then say, okay, well, how are we going to go and make this generalizable to other parts of the world with different populations, and then apply various machine learning techniques to go in and augment your data so that the solution that you ultimately build is more generalizable across different populations. You can also end up with overfitting. It needs to be done well, properly, but there is an element whereby AI helps us generalize beyond the data that we have in our trials.
So, with all that we've been talking about, Polly, I wonder if you might share some insights about what's happening within Google, because we're of course excited to use your tools day to day to try to make an impact on the industry. It really, the example of what we've done in assisting Johns Hopkins certainly wouldn't have come to fruition as easily if we didn't have access to the tool sets that you've invested in as an organization. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the innovations that you're working on?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question there. So I alluded to interoperability before, and there's several ways where we've seen it being core to everything, because you can't create the meaningful insights in healthcare without having the data, with having that data sit in silos across different departments, systems. There's PACS, there's all kinds of systems on the back end. So where we're seeing interoperability powering several different use cases are across care settings, the hospital operational strategy and administration, and research, as we're talking about here. I'll start with the care settings one. So where interoperability comes to play is being able to scale the analysis of data so that you could see patients as a whole human. So earlier I talked about this concept called Patient 360, and that's what we're calling it internally at Google. But it's having this, all the different data points around the person. That person is multidimensional. They're not just a few data points on the EMR system. They've got data on their radiology scans. They've got data on their Fitbit data. They've got all kinds of information about who they are as a person. And this is ultimately going to move us from the more episodic to proactive care, is understanding that patient. A couple weeks ago, we actually just made an announcement with our partner Mayo Clinic on research using AI to improve radiation therapy planning for cancer care. The algorithm that the team created was also created with de-identified data, and would boost patient outcomes and reduce the time it takes to plan radiation treatment. So this is going to have profound impacts on care settings. And the AI project, even though it's in research stages right now, similar to what Dr. Hanley's sharing, we're hopeful that this research is going to be successful and can be translated into tools that are going to impact the care of patients. So that's another example out there of how this is being applied in a care setting. To touch on some of the other examples, so hospital operational strategy and administration, we have a great example here led by HCA. I think we've all seen with COVID, a lot of different processes were accelerated. And with COVID-19, one of the silver linings is there was an entire community of hospitals that came together to really share information and help to move the world forward in this unique time. So HCA created a data portal in combination with SADA and Google Cloud to help communities respond to COVID-19. It's called the National Response Portal, which some of you may have seen in some announcements. But this portal was intended to offer a central place where you could promote data sharing around COVID-19 and how it's spreading in an effort to get hospitals and communities to prepare and respond. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of critical metrics tracked on here, like ICU bed supply, ventilator supply, the total numbers of COVID-19 test results, and total number of healthy patients that have been discharged. So this all gave a community visibility into all of the different data and what was happening in a world where data is so powerful right now and where we really need it for the visibility. So a natural question that comes up is, and Kjell, I wanted to ask your opinion on this first, and then I'd love everyone to weigh in, is where, like, the role of cloud and AI seems evident. Like, there's a clear value proposition here within medical imaging. Do you see AI going as far as replacing clinicians?
No, in short, it's not only is it because, well, we can't, because most of the advances that I'm seeing in the machine learning and deep learning side of things aren't moving towards artificial general intelligence that would be required for this. But there's also an element of, well, we don't need to. Arguably, humans do the tasks that humans do remarkably well. It's all the things that we don't do well that we need assistance for. So there's I highlight the complementarity between these techniques and human intelligence. Artificial intelligence, wonderful when it comes to going and analyzing data at scale, identifying extremely granular patterns. Wonderful, and I think Dr. Hanley's results are showing to this. Wonderful also for driving a consistency that we as human beings are usually not terribly good at doing. But
you're
then,
too nice. We're horrible at it.
Yeah, indeed.
Right. And when you end up with a dead person, it's not good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But at the same time, none of these solutions are looking to deal with any of the. I mean, you throw in that minor challenge of adding in additional data that isn't available to the model at training time. So we as human beings have an easy way of overcoming that. We ask people for more information. We go out and source additional information, or we can reason through a logical chain in ways that these models aren't going to be able to do anytime soon. So it is very much of one of complementarity versus substitution. Substitution, we couldn't, but we also, again, we don't need to. These are more powerful by extending what we as human beings weren't good at doing before.
Yeah.
It's augmented intelligence. To go back to your original concept, it's augmented or artificial intelligence. So I think this is such a great topic for us to close on too. And I'd love to just hear, Bruno, it sounds like you have some thoughts here. Dr. Hanley, I'd love to hear yours too. Maybe we close on this and where we see augmented intelligence, where we see it in the future.
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't know. I'll say a few words and then invite Dan to kind of add thoughts. But to your question and to I think a point that Kjell was making, I'd just like to amplify one thing. We also have to be really mindful that we have a great shortage of the human resources required to meet the demand in the market today. There aren't enough physicians, nurses, and other practitioners available to support the kind of burgeoning demand of healthcare for healthcare across the industry. And so freeing up the humans to do those things that the technology can't is really critical. And now we've got this wonderful opportunity, as we've been talking about through the hour, to apply technology in really creative, really innovative ways. So maybe to get to your point, Polly, we're going to find the technology get traction across the industry. There are going to be administrative processes which just become just less cumbersome as a result of the application of technology to augment and automate much of the filling out of forms and sort of checking on things that humans, heretofore had to pick up the phone and maybe call someone across town, or the provider had to call the insurance company or vice versa to clarify something. We know for a fact, and we've seen that emerging in the industry, that those types of things now, we can drastically reduce the number of unnecessary touch points to achieve the same kind of outcomes at much greater efficiency. But then when we start to turn to the clinical impact, it's a lot of what we've been talking about now kind of applied across much broader segments of diagnostic domains, of care, points of care, that we can really start to impact the quadruple aims, as Kjell noted earlier, in meaningful ways. So improved care experiences, improved care outcomes, improved efficacy of the dollars we're putting into achieving the value we hope to gain. I'll invite Dan to add a little more thought to that.
Sure. I think those are great points, and I think that's the correct direction. I agree with Kjell. We're not going to replace humans. We want humans to do more when we can't solve the medical problems we have right now. So replacing them doesn't make either human or business sense. This is going to work if we can protect human information and protect the individual's identity. We actually ran experiments to see how well we protected identity compared to how well it was being protected in prior clinical trials. That also has more than a 10,000-fold improvement in performance. So I think this can work on populations in the way that I talked about. The third area that I'd have us think about in terms of where is the value proposition and how this is going to be used is I showed you the simplest case for extracting quantitative data about disease from an image. There are 10 at least other qualities that can be named just for this problem, brain hemorrhage, that can be extracted and be given to the care team that have immediate actionability. In many ways, the cloud-based algorithm is a microscope for the CT scan. And we're going to be able to see with precision much deeper into the CT scan where we previously just glossed over the image. 25 years ago, we threw up the image onto a light box, and we looked at it and said, "Yep, there's a brain hemorrhage there." And we can do so much more description now. And this is just the first use example of bringing that description both to single patients and groups of patients.
What a great way to close this out. So I just want to thank everyone. We appreciate everyone that's joining for taking the time to join us. And of course, our panelists for sharing this amazing information. We could safely say that by augmenting human skills, AI really has the ability to improve efficiency, workflow, speed, and then most importantly, which you shared with us, Dan, precision, which begs the question, and this is for the audience for future, is AI our best chance of restoring the care in healthcare?